welcome to the LBF Church podcast, where we talk about topics that help us grow in our affection towards Jesus and also grow more equipped to follow him in the ways that he's leading us. I'm Dan Franklin, and continuing on, we got a couple of new segments that we do now as part of the LBF Church podcast. We answer a question and give a recommendation. So the question, actually, Troy Spillman, one of our pastors, and I did a live Facebook Live Q&A about a week ago, and there were lots of questions that came in, so thanks if you're one of the people who asked one of the questions. But one that we didn't get to, I wanted to get to now. And so this was from Tammy Strassen, and she was asking about the doctrine of the resurrection, because I've just taught on this. By the time this video will be posted, it'll be about 3 weeks afterwards. But it talked about the final resurrection and the Christian hope of the resurrection of the body. And she asked sort of about the age of our resurrection bodies. What will they be like? Will it be from the time that we died? Will it be from the prime of life? Will there be old people, young people? What about children who die? It's a great question, and it's a question that I'll acknowledge I don't really know. I don't think Scripture gives us a full treatment of those kinds of details. I think the main point when it comes to the resurrection that we look forward to is that our bodies are no longer perishable. They're no longer decaying or decomposing or going from good to bad or from bad to worse. So I don't know about the whole age thing. I think in C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, which is not trying to be a technical treatment of this question, there are some interesting insights just in the whole concept of a person's appearance somehow communicating something about their inner person. And I think that may be something that takes place at the final resurrection, that the way that we're appearing to people shows something about the inside, shows something about our soul and our character, and not just our physical appearance. So it is sort of an I don't know. I tend to think maybe the prime of life, or maybe for each of us, there's a certain age that more marks how we impacted the world. So I'm not sure on that, but there's a couple thoughts on that. Recommendation that I want to give, I think I give a lot of book recommendations, and so this is sort of a book/movie one, because I love movies, and so I also want to recommend movies that I think are good. And this last Sunday, my wife and I showed our boys the movie Emma, that's based on the Jane Austen novel, and which might be weird to some of you because we have 3 sons. And actually, for part of the time we were showing the movie, my wife was out with some friends. So it was just me and my 3 sons watching the movie Emma, which if you've ever read a Jane Austen novel or watched one of the movies, they're very centered on the women characters and main characters. But for me, that was on purpose. I think whether you're a woman or a man, it's good to watch good movies with characters who are different than you. So we wanted to show our boys movies that have women as the main characters so that they can begin to get into that world. I think that will help them. So I want to recommend Jane Austen books and movies. I haven't seen all the different movies, but the 1995 version of Sense and Sensibility is great. I think it was like 2007 version of Pride and Prejudice is really great. If you love your wife a lot and she loves Jane Austen, you may watch the 6-hour version of Pride and Prejudice, but otherwise you can get the normal movie version. But one of the things that I like about this is I feel like the way that Jane Austen writes and the way that the movies come across has a lot of great, deep wisdom in them, because a lot of times the main perspective character, the main woman, will encounter people and her first impression of them is very different. A lot of times the man that the woman ends up getting together with at the end, her first impression is that he's sort of standoffish and not terribly warm, but then she grows to see his real true character, whereas there's usually a guy in it that's very flashy and handsome and interesting, and he turns out kind of to be a con and a fraud. And I think that really reflects a lot of biblical wisdom about not trusting first impressions and experiences and appearances. So overall recommendation about Jane Austen's books and movies: read them, watch them. They're all really great. All right, so now that said, I want to get into the main topic for this episode, which is about the subject of abortion, which I know for almost no one is a pleasant subject to talk about. And yet at LBF Church, we are very overtly pro-life, which has less to do with legislation that we're advocating for and more to do with the fact that we believe that unborn children are human beings created in the image of God. So our main goal as a church is not necessarily to try to get legislation passed, although I think that would be good. Our main purpose is to try to advocate for people if they're having an unwanted or unexpected pregnancy, that is a real human being in there, and to protect that life. And so we support different ministries that do that. And I want to talk about the subject of abortion really related to 3 objections. And the objections are things that I think, if there's a good response, if we're prepared for these objections, it can lead to fruitful conversations with people. Because while I do think pushing legislation and having a public voice is good and beneficial, I think most people's minds are changed in conversations with people that they know. So your greatest influence, if you're wanting to help in the area of having unborn children live to their birth, then I think probably the greatest impact that you can have is on individuals that God places in your life. So 3 objections to sort of the pro-life position, or even the position of thinking that abortion is something to talk about. Objection number 1 is, by talking about this, you are heaping guilt on people. And this is a difficult objection. In fact, every January we have a Sunday at LBF Church where we talk about abortion. And I even struggle, as one of the pastors here, I struggle with how well do we promote this? Because if we get the word out that we're doing this, certain people probably won't show up because they either are pro-choice people or they have an abortion in their past, and so it brings up real difficulties for them. It's pretty undeniable that if you talk about the wrongness of abortion, it will make certain people feel guilty. It will make women who have an abortion in their past relive that guilt if they've experienced guilt about it. It will make men who push their daughters or their wives or their girlfriends to have an abortion bring up guilt and shame for them. And so the objection is not false. It is true that it brings up guilt. The challenge in talking about this is to say that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it. Guilt is a little bit like when you were a kid and your parents told you not to touch the hot pot that's on the burner. The whole idea that those sensors that we have when we react to it, and when we touch something that's hot and then immediately take our hand away, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with that being hot. It just means, all right, that was an indication. That's an indication that there's something that we need to stay away from, or that there's something that we need to have a response to. If you have a response to a sermon or to somebody talking about a different sin, whether it's sexual sin, whether it's abortion, whether it's lying, whether it's physical violence of some sort, if you're having a guilt-based reaction to that, that is simply an indication that there's something to deal with there. And so the fact that this brings up guilt is true. And at the same time, for us as Christians, this is the amazing thing about the gospel of Jesus. Guilt isn't the end. And feeling guilty isn't something that ends up breaking us. I think in our culture, our solution to guilt is decide that it wasn't that bad, whatever you did wasn't that bad, or that it just wasn't wrong at all. So our solution to abortion is to say, it's just not wrong. And so there's no reason for you to feel bad about it because you didn't do anything wrong. Or if you think maybe you did do something wrong, just move on and don't think about it. The gospel of Jesus says you can look at what you did wrong and name it for as wrong as it was, and there's redemption and forgiveness. It doesn't mean we pass over sin and say no big deal. It means we say it was a really big deal, but Jesus forgave that. And so bringing up this subject, while it inevitably does bring up guilt and shame for people, that's not a good enough reason not to talk about it if it's going to help people with that guilt and shame get to a point of forgiveness and joy and grace in their lives, and also if it's going to keep other people from making decisions that lead them to that guilt and that shame. If there was somebody that had an affair and had ended up losing his marriage, or at the very least really deeply hurting his wife over this, and then went to a pastor and said, I need you never to preach on adultery again, because every time you do, there are people like me who are hurt and feel bad about what we've done. I would think the pastor might say, but don't you want other people to be warned so that they don't make the same mistake? This is worth talking about, even though it does bring up guilt and shame, because it can help us get from that point of guilt and shame to forgiveness and redemption, and also because it can warn other people not to make the same mistakes or commit the same sins that lead to that guilt and shame. Objection number 1 is don't talk about it because it brings up guilt and makes people feel guilty. The second objection is when you're having a pro-life position or advocating for the life of the unborn, you're being uncompassionate towards the mother or to the woman in the situation. And this, to me, is something you'll hear this a lot. In fact, in some ways, it is bizarre to me that in our political sphere right now, sort of the stereotype is that for people on the left, politically, for people who are more liberal, they sort of pride themselves on the idea of I care for the needy person. The liberal people will be more on the side of the poor or the marginalized, whether or not they're right. It can be a blind allegiance sometimes, but all right, I'm on the side of the poor. I'm on the side of the immigrant. I'm on the side of the racial minority. I'm on the side of the person who is being oppressed or is in a disadvantaged situation in any way. And so how that fits into abortion is they say, all right, a woman who has a pregnancy and she doesn't end up wanting to have that pregnancy, she's disadvantaged, she's marginalized, and so we need to advocate for her. And to me, the massive, massive blind spot is to say, even as difficult a situation as she is not the most vulnerable person in that context. The most vulnerable person in that context is clearly the unborn child. And unless you're just going to decide that's not a person, which I think both morality and science and even our instincts point toward the fact that that's not a defensible position. If we're going to have compassion, our compassion usually goes towards the most vulnerable person in the situation, and that's the unborn child. I say absolutely there should be things that we do, whether it's on a societal level through our government, or I think even better just through an individual level or through places like a Sure Pregnancy Clinic. People who will say to me, well, pro-life people only care about the baby and not the mother, or they only care about getting the baby born and they don't care about anything afterwards. I always say to those people, you have never once, if you say that, you have never once visited any of these clinics, because that is absolutely untrue. They are caring for the mothers in an emotional way, in a financial way, giving them baby clothes, giving them parenting classes, working with them long after the birth and checking back in with them. Absolutely, there should be lots of compassion for any woman who finds herself in a situation where she's pregnant and she doesn't know what she's going to do because it wasn't a great situation. But if we're really going to play the compassion card, our greatest compassion should go towards those who are the most vulnerable. In the book of Proverbs, in Proverbs 31, early on, there's the great command to King Lemuel, the idea of speaking up for those who cannot speak for themselves. A woman who's in that situation is in a very vulnerable situation, but she actually can still speak up for herself. The baby can't speak up for himself or speak up for herself. So if we're really going to play the compassion card, we should be thinking about compassion for the most vulnerable person in the situation. So, all right, objection number one, you're just bringing guilt on people. Objection number two, what about the caring for the mother? Objection number three, and this is one that is a little different, and I hope to give some help on it, is some people will say, by talking about this, you're just being sensationalistic. You're just trying to whip people into a flurry, or you're just trying to use really provocative language and sort of start a fight and be gross about these things. To me, it's a very interesting question, because it goes to the question. And actually, a friend of mine, Brandon Walters, in that same post about questions that people were asking, asked about the appropriateness of the analogy between abortion and the Holocaust, and was just sort of asking, do you think this is an appropriate analogy? And to me, that points towards the bigger question of using, I guess you could say, provocative language when we're talking about abortion. Some people won't even say kill. Even pro-life people will talk about the termination of a pregnancy, or the removal of the fetus or the removal of the baby. And other people will specifically say, no, we need to use the word kill because we need people to get the weight of what's going on. Other people will say, no, kill isn't even good enough. You need to use the word murder, because this isn't just kill. Sometimes somebody is killed and nothing immoral has happened because of the broader situation. But the idea here is that murder, because this is intentional killing. Some people show pictures, in speeches. Scott Klusendorf, who does a lot of work in the pro-life area, and he gives warnings always before he does this, but he shows pictures of babies who have been aborted to sort of have people live with the gravity of all of this. So I'll say a couple things on this. The first thing I'll say is, I do think, going back to Brandon's question, is the abortion and the Holocaust, is that appropriate? I would say, I think you got to look at what situation you're talking about this in. I do think whether you're in a situation where you're protesting or you're holding up signs or in a large context, you're trying to get the word out about the position, that's where I might look at it and say, yeah, I could see a place for the more appropriately provocative language and images where you're trying to point out to people what they are doing and what our society is approving of. The point where I think there is a good parallel between the Holocaust and what we do with abortion is that in the Holocaust, a group of people decided the Jews don't count. They just don't count as people. In our country, we had times where black people just sort of didn't count. They're not real humans. We've decided that they're not on the same level as the rest of us. We as a society have said about unborn children, they don't count. They don't get a vote. And so that's where I think the parallel is. And certainly with the number of unborn children who have died, unless you're going to say they aren't people or they don't count or they're not real human beings in there, you can't deny the scope of all of this. But I think if you're having a personal conversation, and I believe that most people's minds are changed through personal conversations, and you're talking to a woman who's saying, well, I'm thinking about having an abortion, I don't think that it's going to be helpful in that personal conversation to say, well, but by doing that, you'll murder your child or you'll be participating in a Holocaust. I think that some of us have an aversion to just being manipulated through those kinds of arguments. I would say more, you've got to look at it and you've got to discern, all right, as I'm talking to this person, most people who have an abortion don't want to have an abortion. And so assuming that you're talking to somebody who's not calloused and just saying, who cares, what's the big deal, somebody who actually is feeling the weight of this, the biggest thing that I would recommend is not using sensationalistic language. The biggest thing that I would recommend is trying to point them towards the long term. We make most of our bad decisions based on what's before our eyes right now and assuming that what we see right now is most important. This even goes back to my recommendation of Jane Austen books and movies, that I think these are so good because they show us that what we first see and our first conclusion on a matter often aren't right. They often aren't seeing the whole picture. And so to be able to say to a woman who's saying, well, I got to go have an abortion, otherwise I'll never finish school, of even having the time to say, well, is that even true? There are a lot of people who end up finishing school. And the ladies at a Sure Pregnancy Clinic will say that women will come in and say, I can't have a baby right now. And they'll remind them, you're not having a baby right now. You're having a baby 8 months from now. And so what do you think might be in place at that point? But I think most profoundly, for those of us who are believers in Jesus, we have the opportunity to say, God brings redemption out of the darkest situations. And if we find ourselves in a dark situation and we simply abandon God's way and say, I've got to take matters into my own hands, not only are we going to suffer repercussions from that disobedience to God, but we are going to be thwarting beautiful redemption that He has set up because we take the expedient way. When we trust God instead of taking matters into our own hands, we open the door for Him to tell a beautiful story that doesn't involve death and murder and disobedience and compromise and expediency, but allows God to shine His light. So if you're having a personal conversation, the sensationalistic language probably isn't going to help, but what will help is showing compassion to that person and trying to point them towards the reality that their situation might seem helpless or hopeless right now. But even without bringing God into the picture, that's not accurate. And when you bring God into the picture, when you believe in a God of redemption, this is the beginning of a beautiful story that He's going to tell. And if you talk to women who went ahead and kept their babies or took their babies to term when they were in really bad situations, you consistently hear beautiful stories of the ways that God brings good out of dark situations. So that's some thoughts on that. Certainly there's a lot that I didn't cover on the subject. I'm not going to pretend that I did cover it all. If you go back into our sermon archives and look at the last several years of Sanctity of Life Sunday messages, which are usually the third week in January. You can check out more resources and more kind of ways to think about this and talk about this if you're looking to become more equipped. You can also Google or YouTube Scott Klusendorf or my father-in-law, Randy Alcorn, who's written a lot and speaks a lot on this. They're very helpful on this subject. So that's what I have to say on that, and thanks for taking the time to listen. If you're just hearing this podcast for the first time, there's a couple ways that you can get access to it. You can go on our site, lbf.church, and we have a tab that says blog and podcast. If you click on that, it'll take you right to the feed, and you can click on different episodes and watch the videos. Sometimes it's me, sometimes I have a guest on here and we're discussing something. And you can also just go to iTunes and download the LBF Church podcast and give us a review or give us a rating, especially if it's a good rating, because that'll help us get the word out to more people, because we want to help people grow in their affection towards Jesus and grow more equipped to follow him in all the ways that he's leading. So until next time, I'm Dan Franklin, and this is the LBF Church Podcast.